Good evening, and welcome to the Sleepy Stories channel. Here you will find peace, comfort, and stories that will help you leave the worries of the day behind. Make yourself comfortable, relax, close your eyes, and let the words transport you to a world of peace and dreams. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it so that you always have a new story at hand for a peaceful sleep. And now, let's begin.
The year was 1119, and the Holy Land stood at a fragile crossroads. The First Crusade had ended 2 decades earlier, leaving a scattering of Christian-held territories in a region still brimming with hostility. The streets of Jerusalem might have felt safe within the city walls, but beyond them, the roads leading to sacred sites were perilous. Pilgrims, poor farmers, noble ladies, even repentant knights were being ambushed by bandits, enslaved by raiders, or simply killed for their meager possessions. Every journey to the Holy Sepulchre risked becoming a one-way trip. Into this dangerous world stepped a French knight named Hugues de Péan, a man of deep piety but also clear-eyed practicality. Hugues saw that swords could serve Christ as well as prayers. With 8 fellow knights, he swore a solemn oath in the presence of the Patriarch of Jerusalem to live as monks, to fight as soldiers, and above all, to protect pilgrims making their way to holy places. This was no small commitment. The men renounced personal wealth, took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and pledged their lives to a cause that could end at any roadside ambush. Their headquarters was no ordinary lodging. King Baldwin II granted them quarters on the Temple Mount, in a wing of the former Al-Aqsa Mosque, believed by Crusaders to stand on the site of King Solomon's Temple. From this sacred location, the knights took their name, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, or simply the Knights Templar. Their appearance was stark and symbolic, a plain white mantle for purity, marked with a bold red cross for martyrdom. They were not wandering mercenaries. They were an armed brotherhood, accountable only to the Pope himself. This made them immune from local political squabbles, a fact that would both empower them and in time make them dangerous to their enemies. In their early years, the Templars were few in number and modest in resources, relying on donations from nobles in Europe who saw them as the Church's sword arm in the East. But word of their courage began to spread. Pilgrims spoke of white-cloaked knights riding fearlessly into danger, cutting through ambushes like avenging angels. In an age when faith and war were inseparable, the Templars embodied both, holy men who carried Bibles in their hearts and steel in their hands. It was the beginning of an order that would grow far beyond its humble origins, building a legacy of castles, wealth, and mystery that would haunt history for centuries. Long before swords were drawn in the Holy Land, another group had already planted its roots in Jerusalem, not as warriors, but as caregivers. The Order of the Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, later known simply as the Hospitallers, began in the 11th century as a humble brotherhood tending to sick and weary pilgrims. In a city sacred to 3 faiths, they offered medicine, food, and shelter without asking questions about a traveler's birthplace or past sins. But after the First Crusade in 1099, the world around them changed. The streets filled not only with pilgrims, but with soldiers, merchants, and spies. The air itself seemed thick with tension. The Hospitallers realized that compassion alone would not shield their patients from raiders or war. Under the leadership of Blessed Gerard and later his successor, Raymond Dupuy, the order transformed from a purely charitable mission into a militarized brotherhood. The black cloak they had worn as healers gained a new emblem, a white 8-pointed cross, symbolizing the virtues they vowed to uphold: faith, humility, mercy, and justice among them. Their role expanded dramatically. No longer confined to hospital wards, the Hospitallers built and manned formidable castles across the Crusader states. Fortresses like Kesha el-Chevalier in Syria, whose walls would come to be feared by Muslim armies and admired by fellow Crusaders. Within these walls, their dual identity thrived. In one hall, they cared for the sick and wounded. In another, they trained with sword and shield, preparing for the next call to arms. Unlike the Templars, whose reputation rested heavily on elite battlefield prowess, the Hospitallers cultivated a balance between war and charity. A Hospitaller knight might spend one day defending a fortress tower from a siege and the next changing bandages in a hospital ward. This blend of martial skill and compassion won them widespread respect among both allies and, grudgingly, enemies. Papal recognition in 1113 cemented their independence, placing them under the direct authority of the Pope, free from local rulers' control. This autonomy allowed the Hospitallers to grow wealthy and powerful through donations of land and treasure from across Europe. Every noble who sought spiritual redemption found the Hospitallers a worthy cause to support. By the mid-12th century, the order had become a cornerstone of Crusader defense and logistics. They were not simply soldiers or medics. They were the lifeline of the Crusader states, standing watch over both the living and the dying in a land where the two were often only a sword's length apart. While the Templars and Hospitallers were already well established in the Holy Land, the Order of Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem, better known as the Teutonic Knights, was born from a more specific need to serve German-speaking pilgrims and crusaders. The year was 1190, and the Third Crusade was raging. Outside the besieged city of Acre, the conditions were grim. Disease, heat, and wounds claimed more lives than swords. Among the chaos, a group of merchants from Lübeck and Bremen erected a field hospital under a simple tent of ship sails. Its mission was humble but vital, to care for their countrymen in a foreign land where language barriers could mean the difference between life and death. What began as a makeshift infirmary soon grew into a recognized order. In 1198, under the blessing of Pope Innocent III, the Teutonic Knights were formally established as a military monastic order, blending the Hospitallers' healing mission with the Templars' martial discipline. Their habit was striking, a white mantle bearing a bold black cross, a stark contrast to the sunburnt sands of the Levant. Initially, their numbers were small and their influence limited compared to the older orders. But they had one advantage: strong ties to the Holy Roman Empire. Many of their recruits were seasoned German knights, loyal to their homeland's rulers and eager to carry imperial prestige into the Crusader states.
They built hospitals, fortified outposts, and joined major campaigns, often fighting alongside their Templar and Hospitaller counterparts. Yet the Holy Land would not be their final stage. The Teutonic Knights soon turned their gaze north and east, where pagan tribes still resisted Christianization. In the early 13th century, they embarked on the Baltic Crusades, carving out a Crusader state along the shores of the Baltic Sea. There they built towering castles of stone, imposed Christian rule, and engaged in decades of brutal warfare against the Prussians, Lithuanians, and Samogitians. In both the Holy Land and Europe, the Teutonic Knights combined fierce military campaigns with an organized, almost bureaucratic approach to governance. They were not just warriors. They were colonizers, administrators, and master builders. Their order's rigid discipline, German efficiency, and unyielding faith made them a formidable force, admired by allies, feared by foes. Though their origins lay in a small hospital tent outside Acre, the Teutonic Knights would grow into one of the most powerful and enduring military orders of the medieval world, leaving a legacy of stone fortresses and contested frontiers. Though the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights differed in origins and missions, they were bound together by a common foundation, the monastic rule that shaped their lives. Joining one of these orders meant more than picking up a sword. It was a total surrender of personal freedom to a life of obedience, discipline, and faith. A recruit, often a knight of noble birth, would renounce all personal wealth upon admission. Lands, titles, and income were handed over to the order, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and the weapons issued to him. In exchange, he received the habit of the order. For Templars, the white mantle with its red cross. For Hospitallers, the black cloak with a white cross. For Teutonic Knights, the white with black. These garments were not simply uniforms. They were symbols of vows taken before God. Life within the order followed a strict rhythm. Days began and ended with prayer, often in the chill of a candle-lit chapel. Meals were eaten in silence, while scripture was read aloud, a reminder that the knight's body was fed for one reason only, to serve God in battle or charity. Luxuries were forbidden. No hunting for sport, no decorative armor, no brightly colored clothing. Horses were shared between knights, and personal servants were strictly limited. Even letters from home could be inspected by superiors to prevent distraction from the mission. Above all, knights were expected to live by the 3 monastic vows: poverty, owning nothing for themselves; chastity, foregoing marriage and family; and obedience, carrying out orders without hesitation. But to these vows, the military orders added another: the defense of Christendom, even to the point of martyrdom. A knight was to stand his ground against the enemy, never fleeing unless ordered, and to protect pilgrims, widows, and orphans from harm. Breaking these rules could mean harsh penance, fasting, public humiliation, or even expulsion from the order. Yet the discipline forged by this code created some of the most feared and respected warriors of the medieval world. Their enemies might see them as fanatics, but to fellow Christians they were holy champions, steel-clad monks who served not for gold or glory, but for the salvation of souls. It was this strict code that allowed small groups of knights to hold fortresses against armies many times their size, to march into hopeless battles without fear, and to inspire awe across Europe and the Middle East. The code was their strength, and in some ways the seed of their eventual downfall. The Crusader orders did not simply patrol roads or guard gates. They reshaped the very landscape of the medieval Near East. Castles were their lifeblood, both symbols of power and anchors of survival in a hostile land. For the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights, these fortresses were more than military bases. They were centers of administration, supply depots, and rallying points for Christian defense. One of the most legendary was Crac de Chevalier, a hospital stronghold in modern-day Syria. Perched high on a hill, it looked almost like a city unto itself. Massive concentric walls, deep moats, and towers that could rain death on any approaching army. It could house thousands, store years' worth of supplies, and withstand siege engines for months. Even the great Muslim leader Saladin avoided a direct assault, knowing it would drain his forces. The Templars had their own chain of fortresses, each strategically placed to guard key routes. Safed Tortosa and the coastal stronghold of Chat-Pelair bristled with high walls and angular defenses designed to deflect stones and arrows. Inside, they contained chapels, barracks, storerooms, and systems to collect rainwater, every inch planned for the long grind of siege warfare. The Teutonic Knights, though less prominent in the Levant, would make their architectural mark in the Baltic. Their castles in Prussia and Livonia were not just fortresses, but symbols of colonization, built in stark brick and stone, dominating the surrounding countryside. Structures like Marienburg Castle in modern-day Poland
became administrative capitals, housing not only soldiers but also officials, scribes, and treasuries. These castles were rarely built for beauty, yet their imposing presence inspired awe and dread alike. Walls could be 10 meters thick, gates reinforced with iron, and towers positioned to allow crossfire on attackers. Inside, the layout reflected the dual life of the orders. Chapels for prayer stood beside armories stacked with weapons. Kitchens and refectories supported daily life, whilst underground storerooms held enough grain and salted meat to last through years of isolation. Maintaining these fortresses was a monumental task. Supplies had to be shipped from Europe, skilled masons and engineers employed, and garrisons kept ready for sudden attacks. But in a world where alliances shifted quickly and borders were drawn in blood, the castles of the Crusader orders were unyielding anchors, visible proof that faith, steel, and stone could hold back the tide of enemies.
Though the Crusader orders were born in vows of poverty, their influence soon made them some of the wealthiest institutions in medieval Christendom. From castles in the Holy Land to estates in France, England, and Germany, the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights controlled vast networks of land, farms, mills, and ports. These holdings were gifts from kings, nobles, and merchants who believed that donating to the orders would secure divine favor and perhaps a few earthly advantages. The Templars, in particular, mastered a skill that would change European finance: banking. Pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land faced a dangerous problem. Carrying large sums of coin made them prime targets for thieves. The Templars solved this with a system of letters of credit. A pilgrim could deposit funds at a Templar preceptory in Europe, receive a written note, and then withdraw the equivalent in the East. This not only kept the pilgrims safe, but also allowed the Templars to transfer and invest funds on a massive scale. Soon kings themselves began using Templar treasuries. The order became bankers to monarchs, financing wars, managing royal revenues, and safeguarding national treasures. Their network of fortresses doubled as secure vaults, each garrison a heavily armed branch office. The Hospitallers, though less involved in banking, accumulated their own immense resources through rents, agricultural production, and the spoils of war. Their estates in Europe funded hospitals, castles, and fleets, ensuring their military and charitable work never lacked supplies. The Teutonic Knights, operating in the Baltic, built a self-sustaining economy from conquered lands, levying taxes, monopolizing trade routes, and exploiting resources like amber, a luxury commodity in medieval Europe. Wealth brought undeniable advantages: better armor, stronger castles, and the ability to hire skilled mercenaries when manpower ran short. But it also drew suspicion. In an age when the Church preached humility, the sight of warrior monks dining well, wearing fine cloaks, or holding sway over kings could provoke envy and fear. Still, for centuries, their riches underpinned their military and political dominance. These were not isolated bands of sword-wielding zealots. They were global organizations with logistical networks stretching from London to Acre, from Lubeck to Cyprus. Their coin could buy ships, armies, and influence, making them as much a force in medieval politics as on the battlefield. In the Crusader era, gold and faith marched hand in hand, and the military orders knew better than anyone how to wield both. The military orders were forged in the crucible of war, and their reputations were sealed on blood-soaked battlefields. From the Levant to the Baltic, the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights fought in some of the most desperate campaigns of the medieval world, often as the shock troops who could turn the tide, or as the last to stand when all hope was gone. One of the Templars' most famous moments came at the Battle of Montgizard in 1177. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, stricken with leprosy, led a vastly outnumbered force against Saladin's army. The Templars charged with ruthless precision, shattering the Muslim vanguard and throwing Saladin's ranks into chaos. The victory was a stunning display of discipline over numbers, cementing the Templars' legend as fearless warriors. The Hospitallers earned their own immortal glory during the Siege of Rhodes in 1480, centuries after the loss of the Holy Land. Facing a massive Ottoman fleet and tens of thousands of soldiers, the Hospitallers held out for weeks, their walls battered but unbroken. Every breach was met with sword and shield, and their blend of medical care and martial ferocity kept the defenders fighting even as casualties mounted. The Teutonic Knights, meanwhile, shifted the theater of war northward. Their defining moment came at the Battle of Grunwald in 1010, when they faced a combined Polish-Lithuanian force. The clash was one of the largest in medieval Europe, and for the Teutonic Order, it ended in disaster. Their Grand Master fell, thousands of knights lay dead, and their power in the Baltic began to wane. Yet even in defeat, their disciplined formations and heavy cavalry charges were remembered as models of medieval warfare. The orders also played crucial roles in less famous but equally vital campaigns, defending supply lines in the Holy Land, escorting pilgrims through enemy territory, and launching raids deep into hostile lands to disrupt enemy logistics. Their mobility, training, and iron discipline allowed them to fight both in open field battles and in grueling sieges, adapting to terrain and circumstance. In victory, they were hailed as God's champions. In defeat, they were martyred in the eyes of their supporters. Their banners, whether bearing the red cross, the white eight-pointed cross, or the black cross, became rallying points on battlefields from Jerusalem to Prussia. These campaigns, both glorious and tragic, carved the orders into the stone of history, not just as monks or warriors, but as symbols of an era that faith and war marched as one. The Crusader orders had been born in the age of the Great Crusades, but as the centuries passed, the world that had created them began to change. By the late 13th century, the Christian strongholds in the Holy Land were falling one by one. The Templars fought fiercely at Acre in 1291, but when the city fell, the last major Crusader outpost in the east was gone. The orders retreated to Cyprus, Rhodes, and eventually Malta, but the dream of a Christian kingdom of Jerusalem was over. Without their original mission, the orders faced an identity crisis. They still possessed immense wealth, vast lands in Europe, and powerful armies, but no longer fought for the same unifying cause that had made them indispensable. And in an age when kings grew wary of rivals, that made them dangerous. The Templars faced the harshest fate. In 1307, King Philip IV of France, deeply indebted to the order, moved against them with ruthless efficiency. On a single day, Templars across France were arrested, accused of heresy, blasphemy, and secret rites. Under torture, many confessed to impossible crimes. Pope Clement V, under Philip's pressure, dissolved the order in 1312. Its lands were seized, its leaders burned at the stake, and the once proud Red Cross vanished from the battlefields of Europe. The Hospitallers and Teutonic Knights survived longer, but not without decline.
The Hospitallers relocated to Rhodes, becoming a naval power against the Ottomans. Yet they never regained the scale of influence they once held. The Teutonic Knights suffered a crushing blow at Grunwald in 1410, and their Baltic empire slowly crumbled under the pressure of rising nation-states and the Protestant Reformation. By the 16th century, the great age of the crusading orders was over. Gunpowder had transformed warfare, making the towering stone castles that once symbolized their dominance increasingly obsolete. Monarchs now commanded standing armies, reducing the need for independent knightly orders. Yet their decline was not merely military. It was political. In an era when centralized power was everything, independent institutions with their own armies, fortresses, and treasuries could not survive without the favor of kings. For some, like the Templars, that favor vanished overnight. For others, it faded slowly, replaced by suspicion, envy, and the shifting priorities of a Europe entering the Renaissance. The legacy of the orders would live on, but their golden age, when a knight could be both monk and warrior, banker and builder, was gone forever. The fall of the great Crusader orders did not end their story. It transformed it. Stripped of their political power and military might, they entered a new battlefield: memory, myth, and legend. Over the centuries, the names of the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights would echo not just in history books, but in whispered rumors, romantic tales, and conspiracy theories. The Templars became the most enduring in popular imagination. Their sudden destruction in 1312, their wealth disappearing into shadow, and the haunting execution of Grand Master Jacques de Molay, who, according to legend, cursed King Philip and the Pope as he burned, created fertile ground for speculation. Stories emerged of hidden treasure, secret knowledge, and ties to the Holy Grail. From medieval romances to modern novels, the Templars have been recast as guardians of sacred relics, keepers of forbidden truths, or victims of a colossal injustice. The Hospitallers took a different path. Though they no longer ruled vast Crusader states, they endured by adapting. As the sovereign military order of Malta, they continued their tradition of charity and medical care. Their eight-pointed cross still recognized around the world. Even stripped of castles and armies, their legacy of service outlasted the empires that once sought their destruction. The Teutonic Knights, too, persisted. Though their Baltic empire dissolved, the order survived as a religious and charitable institution. In modern times, they shifted from battlefield to philanthropy. Their Black Cross still a reminder of their disciplined, if sometimes brutal, medieval origins. Legends surrounding these orders often blur the line between fact and fiction. Chroniclers exaggerated their deeds, enemies slandered them, and poets wove them into tales of romance and betrayal. The Templars' alleged connections to Freemasonry, the Hospital's secret diplomatic missions, and the Teutonic Knights' supposed lost relics all fed a centuries-long fascination. Their architectural legacy remains visible in stone fortresses scattered across Europe and the Middle East. Crac de Chevalier, Marienburg, and Chateau Pellerin, standing as monuments to a time when faith was defended with steel. Today, the crusading orders occupy a unique place in cultural memory. They are part history, part myth, symbols of both the piety and brutality of the medieval world. Whether seen as holy warriors, ruthless conquerors, or mysterious guardians of ancient secrets, they continue to capture imaginations. Proof that though their banners no longer fly in battle, the Crusader orders have never truly left the stage of history. The story of coffee in the Ottoman Empire begins not in Istanbul, but far to the south in the rugged mountains of Yemen. By the early 15th century, Yemeni Sufi mystics had already been brewing the roasted beans as a way to stay awake during long nights of prayer. From the port of Mocha, this strange, dark drink began its journey northward, carried in the holds of merchant ships along the Red Sea trade routes. When coffee first reached the imperial capital, it was unlike anything the Ottomans had tasted before. Tea was not yet common, and wine was forbidden by Islamic law. So this bitter, aromatic brew occupied a unique space. It was neither intoxicating nor bland. It awakened the mind while keeping the body alert, making it a natural companion for conversation, reflection, and work. The earliest cups in Istanbul were served in the private chambers of the elite. Palace kitchens experimented with the drink, perfecting its preparation in small copper pots known as jezves, and serving it in delicate porcelain cups without handles. The Ottomans quickly elevated coffee to an art form. Finely ground beans were simmered slowly over low heat, often sweetened and sometimes spiced with cardamom. The brewing process became almost ceremonial, a performance in miniature. Coffee's arrival coincided with a period of intense cultural flourishing in the Ottoman capital. Istanbul in the mid-1500s was a melting pot of languages, faiths, and trades. Its markets teeming with goods from 3 continents. Coffee fit perfectly into this cosmopolitan atmosphere. Merchants from Syria, Yemen, and Egypt found eager customers among Istanbul's residents, who were always keen to sample the latest luxury from abroad. At first, coffee remained a drink for the wealthy and well-connected. Bags of beans were expensive, and brewing required specialized utensils. But its popularity grew rapidly, and soon the demand outstripped the palace walls. Traders began importing coffee in bulk, and enterprising vendors prepared it for common citizens. What had once been a rare indulgence of the court started appearing in workshops, markets, and street corners. By the time the first public coffee houses opened in Istanbul in the 1550s, the drink had already transformed from an exotic curiosity to a social necessity. In just a few decades, coffee had not only entered Ottoman life, it had begun to reshape it. From humble Yemen origins, it was on its way to becoming the beating heart of urban culture in one of the world's greatest empires.
By the mid-6th century, coffee had spilled beyond the confines of elite households and palace kitchens, and Istanbul was ready for a new kind of social space. The city's bustling streets, lined with spice markets, bathhouses, and mosques, now gained an entirely new fixture, the public coffee house. The earliest recorded establishments appeared around 1554, founded by 2 enterprising men from Aleppo and Damascus. They recognized that coffee was more than a drink. It was a reason for people to gather. In these modest shops, small copper pots simmered over glowing charcoal, filling the air with a rich, earthy aroma. Wooden benches lined the walls, and customers sat shoulder to shoulder, sipping from porcelain cups as they engaged in conversation, watched storytellers, or played backgammon. These coffee houses were revolutionary for Ottoman urban life. Until their arrival, most public gathering spaces were tied to religion, trade, or leisure activities like the bathhouse. The coffee house created a neutral ground, open to merchants, artisans, scholars, soldiers, and travelers alike, where social boundaries could blur. A janissaire might find himself sharing a table with a poet, or a merchant might overhear a debate between 2 theologians. The atmosphere was lively, often accompanied by the clack of game pieces,
the rhythmic recitation of poetry, or the laughter of friends exchanging gossip. A single cup of coffee might last an hour, giving patrons ample time to talk, listen, and observe. Unlike taverns which served alcohol, coffee houses encouraged clear-headed discussion, making them safe havens for both spirited debate and quiet reflection. Coffee house owners quickly learned that the environment mattered as much as the drink. Many decorated their spaces with carpets, lamps, and calligraphy. Some hired musicians or storytellers to keep patrons entertained. Others became known for their particular brewing style or for adding unique spices to the coffee. It didn't take long for these establishments to spread across the empire. From the capital to provincial towns, coffee houses became landmarks in the urban landscape. They served as morning meeting spots for tradesmen, afternoon retreats for scholars, and nighttime stages for performers. But their openness also attracted attention from the authorities. Here, conversations could wander from harmless poetry to sharp political critique. Within just a few years of their rise, coffee houses would become both cherished centers of community and suspect arenas in the eyes of the state, a dual reputation that would follow them for centuries. From their earliest days, Ottoman coffee houses became more than places to drink coffee. They were stages for culture. In a city where literacy was prized but not universal, these spaces brought the arts to life through performance. The moment you stepped inside a well-known coffee house in Istanbul's Tatakal or Üsküdar districts, you might be greeted not by a merchant calling for orders, but by the rhythmic, almost hypnotic voice of a storyteller. Storytellers, known as medas, were masters of the spoken word. With a cane in hand and a scarf over their shoulder, they shifted effortlessly between characters, mimicking voices and weaving tales drawn from Ottoman history, folklore, and the wider Islamic world. They could make sultans seem as human as a neighbor and turn everyday mishaps into comedies that had the entire room laughing. Coffee houses gave these performers a platform, and in return, the meta gave coffee houses their soul. Poetry, too, thrived in these smoky rooms. Patrons recited poems by the great Ottoman poets like Baki and Fuzuli, or improvised their own in a spirit of friendly competition. Poetic duels, where two wordsmiths exchanged witty couplets on the spot, were as exciting as any backgammon match. The slow sipping of coffee seemed to encourage both the patience to listen and the creativity to speak. Music was another frequent guest. Some coffee houses became known for the soft strains of the oud or ney, their melodies blending with the low murmur of conversation and the clink of cups. In certain venues, shadow puppetry performances, karagos and hivat, would draw crowds in the evenings, their playful banter and social satire making both children and adults laugh. These artistic gatherings blurred the lines between entertainment and education. Stories carried moral lessons, poems conveyed philosophical reflections, and songs preserved oral traditions. For many, the coffee house was not just a social venue, but an informal school, one where you could learn history, language, and wit without ever opening a book. As word of these vibrant gatherings spread, artists and intellectuals began to seek out coffee houses as places to test new ideas, refine their work, or simply find an audience. In this way, the Ottoman coffee house became a cultural hub, part theater, part classroom, part salon, where creativity could thrive in the warm glow of oil lamps and the steady scent of freshly brewed coffee. While poetry and storytelling gave Ottoman coffee houses their cultural prestige, games gave them their everyday heartbeat. Step into one on a late afternoon, and you'd hear more than just the hum of conversation. You'd hear the sharp clack of backgammon pieces, the shuffle of playing cards, and bursts of laughter as friends teased each other over a well-played move. Backgammon, or tavler, reigned supreme. Its origins stretched back centuries, and in the Ottoman coffee house, it became more than just a pastime. It was a display of wit and strategy. Old men hunched over boards like generals over battle maps, while younger players hovered nearby, learning tricks and debating the odds. The rhythmic roll of dice was as much a part of the coffeehouse soundscape as the simmering Sizvi. Chess held a place of honor too. Patrons who fancied themselves intellectuals would engage in slow, deliberate matches, drawing on tactics as old as Persia itself. A single game could stretch for hours, accompanied by sips of coffee and murmured analysis from onlookers. For many, these games were not just entertainment, they were a way to test one's mind, patience, and composure. Card games, often imported from Europe, added variety to the leisure mix, though some occasionally sparked moral debates. Some religious scholars frowned upon their association with gambling. Yet, in many coffeehouses, they were played in a friendly spirit, with wages limited to pride and bragging rights. Leisure in the coffeehouse extended beyond the games themselves. It was in the pauses between moves, in the long, companionable silences, and in the quiet observation of passers-by through open doors.
Here, men escaped the pressures of work and family for an hour or two, finding comfort in routine. Regulars had their favorite spots, and friendships deepened over countless shared cups. The coffeehouse was also a place where news was traded as quickly as gossip. Merchants shared rumors about market prices. Travelers brought tales from distant provinces, and political developments often arrived here before they were formally announced. A game board might pause mid-match while a patron recounted a new decree from the palace or a scandal from the court. In the Ottoman coffeehouse, leisure was never idle. Every game, every chat, and every sip of coffee wove together into a rich tapestry of daily life, a blend of competition, camaraderie, and the unhurried pleasures that made these establishments indispensable to the rhythm of the city. As Ottoman coffee houses flourished, they became more than cultural salons and gaming parlors. They evolved into political nerve centers. The same qualities that made them ideal for poetry and leisurely debate also made them perfect for the exchange of political ideas. In an empire that stretched across 3 continents, information traveled in fragments, rumors, and whispers, and the coffee house was where those fragments came together. Inside, merchants from the bazaar discussed changes in tax policy. Janissaries shared grievances about their pay, and clerks speculated on shifts in the Sultan's court. A single conversation might jump from the price of grain to the latest military campaign, weaving together local concerns with imperial affairs. The coffee house gave ordinary citizens who had no place in the halls of power a forum to voice opinions and measure the mood of the city. This openness, however, did not escape the attention of the authorities. Sultans and their viziers quickly recognized that coffee houses could act as incubators for dissent. Political satire, woven subtly into a storyteller's tale or a shadow puppet play, could carry sharper criticism than any public speech. News, real or exaggerated, spread rapidly from one coffee house to another, often faster than the state could control. Some rulers tried to curb the influence of these establishments. In the 17th century, Sultan Murad IV famously banned coffee entirely, sending soldiers to patrol the streets for violators. The official reasoning was moral. Coffee was accused of fostering idleness and moral decay, but the underlying concern was its role in gathering politically minded crowds. Still, even under such bans, coffee houses often operated in secret, their doors closing quickly at the sight of patrols, the aroma of brewing coffee hidden behind the smell of cooking. Despite intermittent crackdowns, the political life of the coffee house persisted. In many ways, it was the Ottoman equivalent of a public square combined with a newsroom. Ideas could be tested here, grievances aired, and alliances forged over shared cups. By the 18th century, the authorities realized that coffee houses were too deeply ingrained in urban life to eliminate. Instead, some rulers placed informants among the patrons, listening to the flow of conversation and reporting back to the palace. In this way, the coffee house remained both a symbol of free exchange and a reminder that in the Ottoman Empire, even the most casual conversation could carry weight in the corridors of power. One of the most remarkable features of the Ottoman coffee house was its ability to bring together people who outside its doors might never share the same space. In a society layered with social, economic, and professional divisions, the coffee house blurred boundaries in ways few other institutions could. A typical Istanbul coffee house in the 17th or 18th century might host an astonishing mix: a bearded imam pausing between lessons at the mosque, a wealthy silk merchant from the bazaar, a weathered sailor fresh from the docks, a janissary in full uniform, and a poet seeking inspiration. Here they sat side by side on wooden benches, sipping from the same kind of cup, listening to the same storyteller, laughing at the same witty remark. This social mixing was partly due to coffee itself. Unlike wine, it carried no religious prohibition, and unlike lavish feasts, it was affordable to most city dwellers. A single serving cost little, making it accessible to apprentices, artisans, and laborers. At the same time, the refined preparation and elegant presentation appealed to scholars, officials, and members of the elite. Occupations often shaped coffee house clientele. Certain venues became unofficial headquarters for specific trades. Porters gathered in one, scribes in another, sailors in a third. Yet even in these specialized settings, visitors from outside the trade were welcome, drawn in by the warmth of the stove in winter or the cool shade in summer. Religious and ethnic diversity also played a role in cosmopolitan cities like Istanbul, Aleppo, and Salonika. Muslims, Christians, and Jews sometimes shared the same coffee house, especially in neighborhoods where trade and travel brought communities into close contact. Though tensions could flare, the shared rituals of ordering, serving, and drinking coffee often smoothed over differences, at least for the length of a cup. This mingling of classes and communities was the charm and the danger of the coffee house. For ordinary people, it offered a rare chance to hear perspectives far beyond their own circle. News from distant provinces, gossip from the palace, or philosophical musings from a learned stranger. For the authorities, however, the idea of janissaries chatting freely with merchants or artisans debating with scholars hinted at a dangerous leveling of social hierarchies. Still, it was precisely this blend of voices that gave the Ottoman coffee house its unique energy. Within its walls, status mattered less than wit, eloquence, and the ability to hold your own in conversation. A small but significant taste of equality in a hierarchical world. In the Ottoman Empire, the coffee house was a male-dominant space, a public stage where politics, games, and debates unfolded among men of all ranks. Women, by custom and social expectation, did not frequent these establishments. This absence has often led to the impression that coffee culture was an exclusively male domain, but the reality was more complex. Women were deeply involved in the culture of coffee, just in different settings. In the private sphere of the home, coffee played a central role in hospitality, courtship, and social visits.
A young woman's skill at brewing coffee could even influence marriage prospects, and elaborate serving sets became prized possessions and a dowry. Female guests were served coffee in gilded cups, often alongside sweets, and these intimate gatherings mirrored the conversational and leisurely spirit of the public coffee house, just without the public exposure. Some wealthier women participated in coffee culture through the imperial court. In the Top Kapa Palace, elite women of the harem enjoyed coffee as a daily luxury, served by specialized coffee attendants. The harem's women, particularly the Valide Sultan and favored consorts, could influence politics indirectly, and coffee became one of many luxuries around which courtly intrigues and discussions took place. While it was rare for women to step into public coffee houses, there were exceptions. In cosmopolitan port cities or frontier towns, foreign women, particularly from Europe, sometimes visited out of curiosity, recorded in travelers' accounts as spectacles that surprised local patrons. In certain provincial towns, mixed-gender coffee houses existed on the margins of Ottoman norms, though they were often tied to inns, markets, or entertainment venues. The question of women's presence in coffee houses occasionally entered public debate. Conservative critics feared that any mingling of men and women in such spaces could erode moral boundaries. Yet, these same critics often ignored the vibrant female coffee culture that thrived behind closed doors, where women engaged in the same games, storytelling, and gossip that enlivened the male spaces. In the 19th century, as Ottoman society modernized, new public venues such as European-style cafes and patisseries began to blur these gender divisions. Women of the upper and middle classes, particularly in cosmopolitan centers like Istanbul and Izmir, began to appear in select public coffee houses, still a minority, but a sign that the boundaries were shifting. Thus, while the Ottoman coffee house in its classic form remained a male preserve, women were never absent from coffee culture itself. They simply nurtured their own parallel tradition, one equally rich in conversation, hospitality, and the ritual pleasure of the brew. For all their popularity, Ottoman coffee houses lived under a shadow of suspicion. To the sultans and their advisors, these bustling hubs of conversation were double-edged swords, places of social bonding, yes, but also fertile ground for gossip, satire, and potentially dangerous political talk. The first major crackdown came in the early 17th century under Sultan Murad IV, a ruler famed for his strictness and his personal austerity. Murad believed coffee houses encouraged idleness, undermined morals, and most dangerously, served as meeting grounds for dissenters. In 1633, after a devastating fire in Istanbul, blamed, perhaps unfairly, on careless coffeehouse patrons, Murad ordered the closure of all such establishments. Coffee itself was banned, and violators faced harsh punishments, sometimes even execution. Yet, the closures never truly killed coffeehouse culture. Many establishments went underground, operating discreetly behind shuttered doors or disguised as private homes. Patrons learned to hide their cups and seize at the first sign of patrols. The bans became a cat-and-mouse game between authorities and citizens, with enforcement varying depending on the ruler's temperament. Later sultans, while less severe than Murad, still treated coffee houses wearily. The concern was not just moral decay, but political risk. The Janissary Corps, whose loyalty was vital but unpredictable, often gathered in coffee houses. These meetings could be harmless camaraderie or the seedbed for mutinies. In times of unrest, shutting down coffee houses became an easy way for the government to disrupt potential conspiracies. Even in peaceful times, coffee houses drew suspicion because they were hard to control. Unlike the mosque, they were not under direct religious supervision. Unlike the marketplace, they were not tied to official trade guilds. They were semi-autonomous spaces run by private owners and filled with free-flowing talk, a combination that made bureaucrats uneasy. Some rulers tried regulation rather than outright bans. Licenses were introduced, taxes imposed, and in some cases state informants were placed among the patrons. Storytellers and performers were warned against crossing certain political lines, though many found clever ways to veil criticism in allegory or humor. In the end, coffee houses proved remarkably resilient. Each ban only seemed to deepen public affection for them.
turning the act of sharing a cup of coffee into a quiet gesture of defiance. This tug-of-war between the people's love of coffee and the state's mistrust of its gathering places became one of the most enduring themes in the Ottoman coffee house story. By the twilight of the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the coffee house had already outlived bans, moral crusades, and political suspicion. What began as a Yemen import in the 1500s had grown into an institution so deeply woven into urban life that it was impossible to imagine the empire without it. Even as railways, telegraphs, and European-style cafes transformed city life, the traditional Ottoman coffee house retained its magnetic pull. Its influence stretched far beyond the walls of its smoky interiors. The coffee house had shaped the way Ottomans socialized, debated, and even thought. It had nurtured storytellers, poets, musicians, and amateur philosophers. It had been both the cradle of high art and a stage for everyday humor, where a porter's sharp joke could earn as much applause as a scholar's polished verse. It was a school for listening as much as speaking, a place where news was sifted, opinions tested, and worldviews expanded. The political dimension never disappeared. Even in the empire's final decades, coffee houses served as unofficial newsrooms where discussions about constitutional reform, modernization, and the empire's place in a rapidly changing world could flow more freely than in official venues. Many of the ideas that would shape the early Turkish Republic and modern Middle Eastern politics were first debated over small porcelain cups in such spaces.
Culturally, the Ottoman coffee house left an enduring mark on architecture, literature, and daily ritual. The image of men gathered under low-hanging lamps, smoke curling upward, dice clattering on wooden boards, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingering in the air became a defining scene of Ottoman urban identity. Even today, in cities like Istanbul, Sarajevo, and Cairo, echoes of this tradition live on in neighborhood Karvana, where the pace is unhurried and conversation flows as steadily as the drink itself. Globally, the Ottoman coffee house contributed to the spread of coffee culture far beyond its borders. European travelers carried the idea home, and by the 17th century, coffee houses in London, Paris, and Vienna were thriving, direct heirs to their Ottoman counterparts in both form and function. The legacy of the Ottoman coffee house is not just the drink, but the ideal it embodied, a space where people of different walks of life could gather, exchange ideas, and feel part of something larger than themselves. In a world that changes faster with each generation, that simple promise, a seat at the table, a cup in hand, and a voice in the conversation, remains as powerful as ever. For the samurai, armor, known as yoroi, was far more than a shield against arrows and blades. It was a second skin, a portable biography, and a public declaration of loyalty. Every curve of lacquered plate, every knot of silk cord, every crest painted in gold carried meaning that went beyond the battlefield. In a society built upon rigid hierarchies and deep respect for heritage, armor acted as a visible signature of a warrior's lineage. The family crest, or mon, was often emblazoned on the helmet, kabuto, shoulder guards, soed, and sometimes even on the breastplate, do. To see a warrior's mon was to know his clan, his ancestors, and the legacy he carried into battle. This was not mere decoration. It was an unspoken vow to uphold the honor of those who had worn the same emblem before him. Color was another silent language. Certain hues were reserved for high-ranking families or carried symbolic associations. Crimson could signal courage and a willingness to shed blood for one's lord. Black lacquer conveyed dignity and gravitas. Gold leaf suggested both wealth and divine protection. These choices were deliberate. Every tint and tone was meant to project a specific image to friend and foe alike. Patterns and ornamentation often drew on spiritual symbolism. A helmet might be crowned with a crest shaped like a dragon to invoke ferocity,
or adorned with antlers to channel the power and endurance of the stag. Some samurai incorporated motifs from Shinto and Buddhist beliefs, lotus flowers for purity, waves for resilience, or the rising sun for imperial loyalty. These emblems served as talismans, a constant reminder of the warrior's virtues and the spiritual forces he called upon in combat. Even the lacquered finish itself was more than practical. The glossy surface repelled water and protected the underlying metal or leather, but it also created an almost mirror-like sheen, allowing the armor to gleam in sunlight, a subtle form of intimidation on the battlefield. When an enemy faced the line of samurai, each gleaming suit was a declaration. We are ready, we are united, and we carry the history on our shoulders. To wear yoroi was to embody one's clan, faith, and personal honor. In the mind of the samurai, the armor was not simply clothing for war, it was an extension of the soul. Removing it after battle was not just a matter of loosening cords. It was a return from a heightened state of being where every plate and knot had transformed a man into the living image of his lineage. For the samurai, putting on armor was never done in haste. It was a deliberate, almost ceremonial act, one that could take an hour or more when done properly. This was not merely about strapping on protection. It was about mentally and spiritually crossing the threshold from daily life into the disciplined state of readiness for combat. The process often began with purification. Some warriors would wash their hands and face with clean water, or even perform brief Shinto rites to honor the kami spirits and seek their blessing. Others might recite a short Buddhist sutra for protection, or focus silently on their breathing to steady the mind. Going into battle was not just a physical trial. It was a moral and spiritual one, and the act of donning armor was the gateway. Undergarments came first. A light cotton or silk kimono was worn next to the skin, providing comfort and a base layer to prevent chafing. Over this, a padded jacket, shitagi, and high-date thigh guards would be fitted. These pieces ensured that the heavier plates could be worn for hours without exhausting the body. Each layer was tied with precision, the cords adjusted so they would not loosen in the chaos of battle. Next came the armored components in a carefully ordered sequence. The sunet, shin guards, were strapped on first, followed by the coat armored sleeves. Then the do, or cuirass, was placed around the torso and tied securely at the sides. This central piece was often the most ornate, bearing the clan crest prominently. The soed, shoulder guards, followed, wide and flaring to protect against downward strikes. The helmet, kabuto, was often left for last, as it signaled the final moment before readiness. Secured under the chin with a shinobi no cord, the kabuto's weight and enclosed feeling reminded the warrior that from this point forward he was no longer an individual. He was a samurai in battle form. Assistants, usually retainers or fellow warriors, often helped in the process. This was not simply for efficiency, but as a mark of trust and solidarity. The act of tying another man's armor was intimate and significant. It meant you were preparing him for life or death struggle. By the time the final knot was tightened and the last plate polished with a sleeve, the samurai was transformed. The ritual of preparation had honed his focus, anchored his resolve, and reminded him that he carried not just his own fate, but the honor of his clan into whatever lay ahead. Among all the pieces of samurai armor, none carried more symbolic and psychological weight than the kabuto, the helmet.
It was the final piece placed upon the warrior's head before stepping into battle. And with it came a transformation, not just in appearance, but in spirit. If the yoroi was the body of the samurai's honor, the kabuto was its crown. The design of a kabuto was as much art as it was engineering. Its bowl, or hachi, was often made from dozens of overlapping metal plates riveted together, creating a structure strong enough to deflect arrows and sword strikes. The front featured a visor, mabisashi,
sometimes curved outward to shield the eyes and add a fearsome silhouette. At the back, layered neck guards, called shikoro, fanned out, protecting the nape without restricting movement. But the kabuto's function extended far beyond protection. It was a visual declaration. Many bore elaborate mate, crest-like ornaments mounted on the front, which could take the form of gilded horns, fearsome demons, dragons, or stylized clan emblems. These designs were not random decoration. They were carefully chosen symbols meant to inspire allies, intimidate enemies, and proclaim the wearer's identity across the battlefield. A warrior advancing under a pair of towering antlers or a golden sunburst was instantly recognizable even in the chaos of combat. Inside the kabuto, the yukabari, a silk or cotton lining, helped absorb sweat and provided comfort. The helmet was secured by the shinobino, a cord tied firmly beneath the chin. This knot was critical. If too loose, the helmet could slip at a decisive moment, but if too tight, it could choke the wearer during exertion. Adjusting it was a small but deliberate act, signaling that the samurai was now fully enclosed in his warlike form. There was also etiquette in how the kabuto was handled. It was never placed carelessly on the ground or tossed aside. When not worn, it might rest on a lacquered stand, sometimes displayed in a position of honor in the warrior's home. In ceremonies, it was polished until it gleamed, reflecting the care and pride of its owner. The kabuto was more than just a piece of armor. It was a statement of readiness, a banner for the head, and often a family heirloom passed from one generation to the next. When a samurai lowered it onto his head, it was the final step in a transformation from man to warrior, sealing his role as both protector and representative of his clan's honor. If the kabuto was the crown of the samurai, the do was its beating heart. This central piece protected the torso, the core of the warrior's body, where a single well-placed arrow or sword thrust could end a life. But the do was more than just protection. It was the canvas upon which a samurai displayed his clan identity, personal taste, and even his philosophy of combat. The do evolved over centuries, beginning as heavy iron or leather plates and gradually transforming into the lacquered, segmented marvels of the Son Goku period. The armor was often constructed from horizontal lames, kozane, small scales of iron or hardened leather, laced together with silk cords in intricate patterns. These cords, called odosi, were not just functional. Their colors carried symbolic meaning and could denote rank, clan, or battlefield role. Wearing the do followed its own etiquette. It was fastened around the torso with cords tied in precise knots, ensuring a snug fit without restricting breathing. The front and back panels overlapped to provide extra strength over vital areas. A well-fitted do allowed the samurai to twist, draw his bow, or wield his sword with minimal hindrance, a reminder that mobility was as important as protection. The surface of the do was often a work of art. Some bore the family crest, mon, in gold leaf. Others featured lacquered designs of dragons, waves, or clouds, evoking strength, resilience, and divine favor. These motifs could act as talismans, imbuing the warrior with a sense of invincibility. For those of higher rank, the finish was immaculate, the lacquer polished to a deep shine that caught the light on the battlefield, an intimidating sight for any opponent. Donning the do was a moment of transition. Assistants or retainers might hold it in place as the cords were tightened, checking each knot for security. For a samurai, this step was both practical and symbolic. The chest, home to the heart and lungs, was now shielded by the honor of the clan. In some traditions, a warrior might whisper a brief prayer at this stage, acknowledging the vulnerability of his body and placing his fate in the hands of the gods. Once secured, the do gave the samurai the feeling of being encased in resolve. It was the literal and metaphorical core of his armor, a piece that carried his family history on its surface and guarded his life beneath its plates. While the do protected the core, a samurai could not fight effectively without safeguarding his limbs. The arms and legs were the moving parts of combat, constantly exposed during swordplay, archery, and mounted charges. For this reason, the sword, or shoulder guards, kote, and sune, or shin guards, were essential not just for protection, but for balance and agility. The sword, or shoulder guards, were large rectangular plates that hung from the upper arm, shielding the shoulders and part of the upper torso. Constructed from lacquered iron or leather scales, laced together with silk cords, in intricate patterns, they flared outward to deflect downward strikes from swords or spears. Their movement was carefully calibrated, loose enough to allow the arm to raise a bow or swing a katana, but secure enough to stay in place during rapid maneuvers. Often they bore the family crest or were color coordinated with the do, ensuring the entire suit looked unified. The kote protected the arms from wrist to shoulder. These armored sleeves were made from a combination of chainmail, kusari, metal splints, and fabric padding. The outer arm was heavily reinforced, while the inner arm remained more flexible for ease of motion. Kote were tied at several points to keep them snug, preventing loose fabric from catching on a weapon or an opponent's armor. In close combat, kode could mean the difference between a deflected sword cut and a severed arm. The sune, or shin guards, shielded the lower legs, a part of the body often targeted in foot combat to destabilize an opponent.
Made from vertical iron splints sewn onto cloth or leather backing, sunit was secured with straps behind the calf. The design allowed a warrior to kneel, run, or mount a horse without the plates digging into the skin. Their lacquered surfaces resisted mud and rain, vital in the unpredictable conditions of battlefields. Fitting these limb pieces was a methodical process. The sunat went on first, followed by the pote, and finally the sode. Each step checked for comfort and stability. Assistants often adjusted them to ensure no part of the armor shifted in the heat of combat. Beyond function, these components completed the samurai silhouette. The flaring sode, articulated kote, and sturdy sunit gave the warrior a balanced, imposing form. They were the moving defenses of the armor, enabling offense and defense to work in harmony. Proof that samurai armor was as much about precision engineering as it was about ceremony and honor. In the art of samurai armor, the lower body was never neglected. While the upper torso and head drew the most attention, strikes to the thighs, hips, and groin could be just as lethal. The haidete and kusuzuri formed the essential defenses for this vulnerable region, allowing the warrior to move freely while shielding him from slashes, arrows, and glancing spear thrusts. The haidete were thigh guards worn beneath the kusuzuri, strapped directly over the kimono or padded undergarments. They consisted of small rectangular iron or leather plates sewn onto a fabric panel which wrapped around the front of the thighs like an apron. The design ensured flexibility. The plates overlapped slightly to provide coverage without locking the legs into rigid positions. When kneeling or riding, the haidete flexed naturally, preserving agility in the heat of battle. Above them hung the kusuzuri, skirt-like strips that extended downward from the bottom edge of the do. Usually made in multiple flaring panels, the kusuzuri were constructed from rows of lacquered scales laced together, matching the color and style of the cuirass. Their primary role was to protect the hips, pelvis, and upper thighs, areas particularly exposed when the samurai leaned forward in combat or while mounted. The kusuzuri also served an aesthetic function, completing the visual unity of the armor. They expanded the silhouette of the samurai, making him appear broader and more imposing. The rhythmic sway of the panels as the warrior moved added to his presence, almost like the robes of a ceremonial dancer, except these panels could deflect a sword blow. Fitting these pieces was part of the armor's careful ritual. The haidete were tied first, snug around the waist and upper legs. Then, the kusuzuri, already attached to the do, were adjusted to hang evenly. The spacing between the panels was crucial. Too tight, and the panels would hinder leg movement. Too loose, and they might leave dangerous gaps in protection. Symbolically, these lower body defenses represented steadfastness and stability. Just as a building relied on a strong foundation, a samurai relied on his lower body for power in strikes, balance in stances, and endurance in long battles. Protecting it was both a practical necessity and a metaphor for protecting the base of one's strength. Together, the haidete and kusuzuri turned vulnerable flesh into a fortified base, enabling the samurai to move with confidence, knowing that every step forward was supported by both engineering and tradition. A samurai's armor might have been built from steel, leather, and lacquer, but it was the cords and belts that held the entire ensemble together. Without them, the suit would be nothing more than a scattered pile of plates. The obi, the broad belt, and the network of himo, armor cords, were the hidden lifelines of yoroi, binding not only its parts, but also the warrior's sense of order, discipline, and composure. The obi was the foundation. Worn snugly around the waist, it supported the weight of the swords and sometimes even bore part of the armor's load. Made from thickly woven silk or cotton, the obi was strong yet flexible, able to be tightened or loosened quickly as needed. When donning armor, it was usually tied first, ensuring a stable base before adding heavier components like the do and kusuzuri. The obi also positioned the swords correctly. Katana edge up on one side, wakizashi or tanto on the other, so that drawing them was fluid even under the encumbrance of armor. The himo, or armor cords, were more intricate. These silk laces, threaded through small holes in the plates, binding components together in a system both functional and decorative. The pattern and color of the lacing could identify a clan or indicate rank, but the practical role was paramount. These cords kept armor sections articulated and secure during combat. Tying them was an art. Assistants often helped weave and knot the cords, ensuring each section sat precisely where it should. A poorly tied knot could mean disaster in battle. A loose sewed flapping at the wrong moment. A shifting do that exposed the ribs. For this reason, tying armor was done with the same seriousness as sharpening a blade. Knots themselves carried etiquette. Certain ties were meant to be easily undone for quick removal after battle, while others were locked tightly for maximum security. Samurai trained to know the difference, both for their own armor and when assisting comrades. In the end, the cords and belt were more than practical fasteners.
They were the invisible threads that turned separate parts into a living suit of honor, holding together not just the armor, but the warrior's readiness to step onto the battlefield. For a samurai, armor was not merely equipment, it was an heirloom, a companion, and often a sacred object. To neglect it was to dishonor oneself and one's ancestors. Just as a blade required constant sharpening, armor demanded regular care to keep it battle-ready and worthy of the warrior who wore it. After combat or training, the armor was carefully dismantled piece by piece. Each component, kabuto, do, sode, kote, sunita, was inspected for damage. Dents in metal plates were hammered out by skilled armorers, while frayed cords were replaced with new silk lacing, often dyed to match the original color. Any chips in the lacquer were touched up, both to preserve the armor's appearance and to protect it from rust. Moisture was the armor's greatest enemy. After a rainy campaign or a humid summer battle, every plate was wiped dry, and the cords aired to prevent mold.
Armor was often stored in a dry chest, sometimes lined with rice straw to absorb humidity. The kabuto might be displayed on a lacquered stand, but it was always covered with a cloth to shield it from dust and sunlight. Cleaning was not just practical, it was ceremonial. Some samurai treated the process as a form of meditation, taking the time to reflect on the battle just fought and to prepare mentally for the next. The slow rhythm of untying cords, wiping lacquer, and folding garments became a way of transitioning from the heightened state of combat back to the stillness of everyday life. Respect for armor extended to how it was handled. Dropping a piece carelessly, stepping over it, or placing it in a dirty spot was considered deeply disrespectful. When not in use, armor was stored neatly and in a specific order, ready to be donned quickly if duty called. The armor's longevity was a testament to this care. Well-maintained suits could be passed down for generations, each layer of lacquer and every repaired plate telling the story of past battles. Some samurai even inscribed small messages or prayers inside their armor, knowing that one day their descendants might wear it. In this way, maintenance was not just about preserving a tool of war. It was about honoring a living symbol of duty, loyalty, and family heritage. To tend one's armor was to tend one's honor, ensuring that when the time came to wear it again, it would be as ready as the warrior himself. If putting on armor was a ritual of transformation, removing it was a ritual of return. For the samurai, taking off yoroi was never done casually. It marked the end of a period in which he had been more than just a man. He had been the embodiment of his clan's honor, a living weapon, and a guardian of his lord's will. The process began with stillness. After battle or duty, a samurai would stand or kneel as assistants untied the cords from the outermost pieces. The sode and kusuzuri were usually removed first, their silk laces loosened with deliberate care to avoid tangling. The clatter of lacquered plates hitting one another was the soundtrack of a warrior's shedding his martial shell. The kabuto came next, lifted slowly from the head and placed respectfully on a stand or wrapped in cloth. Removing the helmet was symbolic. It marked the moment when the warrior's mind could lower its guard. For many, the feeling of air on sweat-damp hair was as much an emotional release as a physical one. The do, being the heart of the armor, was often taken off last among the major plates. As it opened and slipped away, the weight lifted from the shoulders was both literal and symbolic. The samurai's body was free again, but so too was his spirit,
released from the focused intensity required in armor. Once all the plates were removed, the undergarments were folded neatly and set aside for washing. Assistants, or the samurai himself, would then inspect each piece for damage, beginning the process of maintenance immediately if needed. Armor was never left scattered. Each component was stored in its proper place, ready for the next call to arms. For some, the removal ritual included a brief prayer of thanks, gratitude for survival, for the armor's protection, and for the honor of fulfilling one's duty. In times of peace, the ritual might be followed by tea or quiet reflection, a way of re-entering daily life with composure. The etiquette of removing armor reminded the samurai that battle was not the only state of existence. Just as a warrior had to know how to fight, he also had to know how to set aside the trappings of war and resume the roles of leader, father, or servant. In this way, the ritual of removal was not an end, but a bridge connecting the world of combat to the world of living and ensuring the samurai remained whole.